There we go. Okay, let's try this again. Good evening, everyone. I just spent the last 3 minutes talking to an audience who was not there because I clicked the go live button, or at least I thought I had clicked the go live button, but I had apparently failed to click the go live button. Okay, let's try this again. Good evening, everyone. There we go. And now my phone is letting me know that it's actually working, which is what I was trying to get it to do in the first place. So here we go. I've been through this introduction once, but you didn't get to hear it because I forgot to click a button. So now I get to go through the introduction again. We are picking up where we left off last week in Matthew chapter 3. I dropped it off in the middle of the chapter, though I try to do sections together because I think that Matthew 3:13 through 4:11 makes more sense as a chapter break than what our Bible has given us. As a friendly reminder, the original documents that make up our Bible did not come with chapters and verses. Those are our inventions in order to more easily navigate them. But that is not that's not something that's original to the text. And so every once in a while I get to feel a little high and mighty by suggesting that maybe whoever broke it down into chapter and verse the first time did a poor job, and I'm actually smarter than them. I don't actually feel that way, but it's nice to pretend every once in a while. Chapter 3, verses 13 through chapter 4:11 is where we are going to be. Again, I remind you that so much of what Matthew does is present Jesus as the ultimate, as the conclusion, as the fulfillment of the journey of God and Israel, and we definitely see that in tonight's passages. We start with one of the quotes we've already gotten from Matthew, "Out of Egypt I called my son," which references Jesus' time in Egypt during his childhood. Matthew presents it as a fulfillment, which I've told you doesn't necessarily mean, doesn't ever in Matthew's, doesn't really in Matthew's work, mean that what it's fulfilling served as a prediction of. Instead, it serves as like sort of an ultimate image of, or a perfection of, would be how Matthew, I think, presented it. As Matthew writes, he really, really works hard to paint Jesus in a way that helps his readers understand him as like the embodiment of Israel. Jesus' lived experience is a short image or snapshot of Israel's lived experience. And so what that means is as he makes his decisions about what material he includes and what material he doesn't include, because John's gospel gives us a note that if everything about Jesus were written down, there wouldn't be enough, libraries on the shelves of all the world in order to contain it all, which is a nice way of saying we left stuff out and there's a reason. And in this case, Matthew has a reason for writing what he does and leaving out what he does. Matthew really works hard to highlight the parts of Jesus' life that serve as a mirror or as an image of some sort to the experience and scripture of Israel, and then shares the stories that reveal the similarities. And so I've got just kind of a quick list of the first couple of chapters of Matthew's gospel, where Jesus serves as the culmination of Israel's genealogy, a genealogy not written like as a detailed, perfect, accurate in the way that we would use the term genealogy like Luke's, but instead more of a thematic and intentional genealogy. You've got the Egypt connection between the people of Israel and of Jesus, both connected to intended violence. First of all, we can look at Joseph, who ends up in Egypt because his brothers wanted him dead. And then at least a couple of them settled on selling him as opposed to killing him. And then Jesus, who ends up in Egypt because Herod wants him dead. And Joseph is warned in a vision and flees. Like Israel, Jesus is called out of Egypt, comes back, finds his way to the promised land out of Egypt. Israel's scriptures point to the work of God, and Matthew keeps finding ways to use those scriptures, even if they weren't initially about Jesus, to remind his audience of Jesus and suggest that the way that God has worked is the same as the way God is working, even if it looks a little bit different. And I think chapter 3 is really where Matthew starts hitting how those connections between Israel's past experience and Jesus' life are so similar. And then especially in what we were looking at tonight, we start getting an image of Jesus as perfectly faithful, as opposed to Israel's often failed faith. So I think that's a good kind of frame up for chapter 3, 14 through 4:11. And then this note I've chosen to include, this really has to do with those of us who have grown up in a church tradition like the Churches of Christ or any Restoration Movement church that puts such a high emphasis on baptism, which I think Scripture does put a high emphasis on baptism. But this is not really one of those passages, and there are a number of reasons why I think that's the truth. Jesus' baptism in this passage is not a post-resurrection event. Jesus is obviously baptized before his death. And then some of the the fact that John is baptizing for different reasons and different purposes, or in some ways different reasons and different purposes, enough so that we've got this guy in the book of Acts named Apollos who only knows of the baptism of John, and is still participating in an understanding of God's work that puts John's baptism at the forefront, which is exactly what we're talking about. So there's some differences there, and John's the one here baptizing, and the Bible notes that there are differences in several places. And so I think I want to free up this passage from the reading that I've was often given of it, in order to better understand why Matthew records it and what I think is really going on here. And this doesn't negate the place of baptism. It just reminds us that in Jesus' day and age, there were a number of forms that ritual washing took. And if we try to read them all flat, we miss some of the nuance and differences that were there. So chapter 3, verse 13. Then Jesus went from Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. But John tried to talk him out of it, which would have been a cardinal sin in the church I grew up in. If somebody tells you they want to be baptized, how dare you talk them out of it? I am the one who needs to be baptized by you, John said, so why are you coming to me? But Jesus said, it should be done, for we must carry out all that God requires. Fulfill all righteousness is probably a better translation there. So John agreed to baptize him. After his baptism, as Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and settling on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. All right, so first and foremost, here's a lovely picture of the Jordan River in the wilderness area that John carried out much of his ministry. This does not look like any river or creek I have seen in Washington State thus far. I'm sure there's one as nasty as this somewhere, but I've yet to come across it. However, if you are from Texas or Oklahoma watching this video, this looks like every creek that you have ever been near. Actually, it may not be quite muddy enough. And so I just want you to get an image of kind of where John is doing his ministry. This does not look like any of the flannel graph scenes of Jesus' baptism that I got as a child. You've got some steep embankments, a whole bunch of scrub brush. Definitely not the cleanest of water. There's a reason in the book of First Kings, I think, Naaman's response to the instruction from Elijah to wash himself in the Jordan is, I'd rather not. I think in some ways he thinks I'd rather have leprosy than get in that water. So this is kind of the scene, absolutely not the location, but kind of what this area looks like where Jesus comes to John for baptism. One of the things that I have heard around this passage for a large portion of my life are questions about why Jesus needed to be baptized if baptism is for the forgiveness of sins. And that's one of the reasons that people are coming to John. As we looked in Matthew's gospel last week, they were coming confessing their sins with a recognition that this marked some sort of new direction for their lives. And so in response to that, because I think that's a valid question to ask, one, I'd say we need to remember that we're talking about baptism during a time period where there were numerous types of ritual washing like baptism that took place, including full body immersion. So the first thing I would say is that when Jesus comes to John, there's no statement about Jesus confessing sin in any way, form, or fashion, which shouldn't be surprising. But that at least tells you that though plenty of people are coming to John, Jesus comes for a different reason. And then Jesus gives a direct statement about what that reason is. Now, none of the other Gospels include this conversation between John and Jesus. Matthew thought it important, at the very least for his audience, to include these words. And I think they serve Matthew's purpose as well, because what he gives is to fulfill all righteousness. Matthew's gospel is all about fulfilling the righteousness of God. And what it means directly here is that Jesus is, in this act, being faithful to his mission and to God. Now, we don't necessarily understand the mechanics of that when we often think of the connection between baptism and sin, but what this story gives us in John's gospel is a reminder that Jesus, there's still this requirement of faithfulness on his part and in this process. And it's apparently enough for John. That reasoning makes perfect sense to John, even if it's lost some of its understanding in our modern world, that it makes sense enough to John that he quits his argument and goes, okay. I think it's also worth noting that in this case, obedience to God is the precursor for the voice of God to show up. So Jesus is baptized and a voice booms out from heaven that says, "This is my son." An interesting thing I want to point out is Matthew's gospel is the only one that gives us those words, "This is my son." In Luke and in Mark, the voice from heaven says, "You are my son," as if it is a direct conversation with Jesus. Matthew records it as, "This is my son." None of the Gospels, none of Matthew, Mark, or Luke tell us whether or not anybody in the crowd hears the voice. And Matthew kind of alludes that maybe people do with the statement "this" as if it's made to other people, as opposed to Luke and Mark saying "you." But I was asked this question actually the other day. I have no clue if other people heard the voice, understood the voice, knew what to do with the voice. But I really like Matthew and Mark with the "you" statement, because it gives us this notion that Jesus receives a confirmation. Of course, in Matthew, that's still absolutely true with the statement, "This is my son." But I think there's maybe an important thing for us to remember, that sort of affirmation matters even to Jesus. I think it's very easy for us to get focused on the divinity of Jesus, the God aspect of his life. But one of the things that all of the Gospels make sure that we understand is that Jesus also has very human experiences. Frustrating moments, experiences of betrayal, hunger, and exhaustion. Those stories are all on the pages of our Gospel. And so just this reminder that Jesus' obedience is met with affirmation by God is a good one. The statement that "this is my son" is also important, because son is also a word used to describe the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. I think Exodus 4 gives us that image, but certainly Hosea 11, whom Matthew quotes in the passage that we looked at last week, "Out of Egypt I called my son," gives us that image. And this is, again, really where we notice some of those distinct corollaries, the correlation between Jesus and Israel. And then this is a phrase I want you to keep on the front of your mind as I read the next section. Jesus moves from the water to the wilderness. Chapter 4, verse 1, we pick up. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. During that time the devil came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread." Jesus told him, "No. For the scriptures say, people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." And the devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple, and said, "If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say he will order his angels to protect you, and they will uphold you with their hands, so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." Jesus responded, "The scriptures also say you must not test the Lord your God." Next, the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. "I will give it all to you," he said, "if you will kneel down and worship me." "Get out of here, Satan," Jesus told him, "for the scriptures say you must worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And the devil went away, and the angels came and took care of Jesus. So I think the temptation story here serves as the perfect transition for Jesus moving into ministry. And I'll explain why as we work our way through these next few slides. First, it's important that we connect the wilderness temptation passage to the baptism passage because of how it connects to Israel's story. These stories make perfect sense read together. And so here's how I think we should read Matthew's pairing and organization here. As Israel moves out of Egypt, they go through the Red Sea. Of course, obviously an important story in Israel's history. They move through the water and into the wilderness for 40 years, where they are tempted on their own journey with God. And we'll talk more about how those temptations pair in just a second. Jesus moves out of Egypt in Matthew's gospel, and then through the water in John's baptism, and into the wilderness for 40 days, where he is tempted on his journey with God. And where Israel fails to be faithful, Jesus succeeds. And it's not just that Israel fails and Jesus succeeds, but it's also in what they fail and succeed. So Israel revolts against God because they're hungry about bread, where they receive manna, and of course then they get sick of the manna. It's one of the things, one of the temptations, one of the challenges Israel faces and struggles. They test God over water. They're going to die of thirst. They complain. It's a real struggle between God and Moses over whether or not God's going to wipe them off the face of the earth. And the place is literally named Massah, test, as a reminder that is a place where they put God to the test. And then third, the temptation that Jesus receives is to worship the devil and bypass the challenges that are in front of him, because what he will have then is Satan step out of the way and say, "Here, have at it," which is not all that dissimilar from the temptation the people face to worship other gods in the wilderness, and at one point, of course, forming up a golden calf. But there are other moments where they're still packing their idols from Egypt with them on the journey. And that's one of the things that Moses challenges them to on several steps of the way throughout the journey, to put away their idols. And in fact, Joshua, I think, has to say the same thing as they move through the water and into the promised land. Yet another good image for us to read into this passage, especially since it was the Jordan River that they had to cross over. So I think those are helpful ways to frame up this reading, this passage, where what we see is Jesus facing the same types of temptations that the people of Israel faced in the wilderness. And yet where the people of Israel struggled, failed, complained, tested God, tried to rely on their own resources, where they did all of that and failed to be faithful to God, Jesus succeeds each and every step of the way. And in that way, it's a bit of a redemption story, But it also lets us know, lets the people of Israel know, that genuine faithfulness to God is possible. And then that way, Jesus serves as a model of what that faithfulness looks like. Now, that produces some challenges because Jesus' faithfulness obviously leads him to a place of struggle and death, and we don't always want to embrace that aspect of faith. We prefer power to sacrifice and to service to others. We'd really rather not have to have our faith cost us that much. Jesus, in this wilderness temptation, certainly has the power at his disposal to make things go exactly the way he would want them to go. Power is not what's at question here. In fact, the temptation from Satan is to use his power in a way that is selfish. So the temptation to turn stones into bread is a temptation to use his power to feed himself instead of relying on God for sustenance, instead of relying on God to provide. The temptation to hop off the temple and let the angels protect him is, I think we've talked about this before. I know I have talked about this before, as if this is a show me passage where Jesus would jump off and lots of people would see him and thereby immediately crown him king. But I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to read it, because I think the bigger image here is the test idea. And I think that does push us back to the ways that the people put God to the test. And maybe the prove it passage there is for Jesus to seek God's affirmation again for his own ministry, which is a failure to rely on what he's already been given by God, including the voice from above at his baptism that confirms Jesus' status as a unique and special son. Begotten is the word often used, but that unique is what it means. And then, of course, the third temptation is, I think, maybe the most educational one. That's the phrase I'll use for us. Because what I think is happening here is that Jesus is being tempted by Satan to allow the ends to justify the means. And that whole, like, ends means economy that we often, get trapped into is worth examining at a deeper level. Because if the end is that Satan says, I'll step out of the way and everything will be in your control and I will let you have at it and stay out of the way. If that's indeed the temptation, and that's how I read it, though I don't, pretend to have a perfect understanding of it, then what is being offered is power without pain, control without the cross. And that's a pretty enticing temptation, I think, if I'm Jesus. And I think we have to acknowledge that these are actual temptations. These are not like Jesus's ABC multiple choice test where if he fills in the right circles, then Satan leaves him alone and he's good. These have to actually be enticing for them to be temptations. And that one especially intrigues me because Jesus uses the same words here, get behind me, Satan, as the, kind of culmination of this, time of temptation. As he does when Peter suggests that Jesus is a fool for talking about the pain and sacrifice that's coming. When Jesus says that he's headed to the cross and Peter says, don't talk like that, that's not what the messiahship is about. When Peter's correcting Jesus on the nature of who Jesus is, Jesus uses these exact same words, which tells me there's something tempting about avoiding the cross. There's a reason that in the garden the prayer is, please let this cup pass from me. And so again, I'm reading that as this part of the temptation. So Jesus is offered a way to an end that does not require the mean of the cross, that does not require that path. And I think about the ways in which we often use some good outcome at the end, or what we think is a good outcome at the end. to justify the decisions that we make to get there, as if what Christianity is most concerned about is the end. And I think part of that is the problem of Western Christianity. We're very, very interested in a personal Lord and Savior who gets us to heaven, because heaven is the most important part of that equation. But if you actually pay attention to the New Testament, the end is always put in the hands of God. And what we are given is a way of living that is not actually all that concerned with making the end within our grasp. It actually does it the other way around. God says, this is the end, so live this way. And that way, of course, is sacrificial and costly, and we prefer to avoid it. Maybe we should do some more understanding of the depth of this temptation and examine the ways in which it shows up in our own lives. When we decide that there is an end that we like and that we are willing to justify any means to get there, we have set the gospel aside and decided that it is not important. What we have decided is that the outcome is important. But Christianity in its nature is a lived ethic. It is a way of being in the world that means something now and not just later. And I think all of that is kind of wrapped up in that third temptation. All right, so I think that pretty well wraps us up for what I was hoping to look at tonight. Jesus moves from Egypt through the water, through the wilderness, and into ministry. And that ministry is not met without conflict, much like the people moving into the land of Canaan did not do so without conflict. And I think it's important for us to recognize that Matthew sets this up this way. Now, again, these are snapshots. It's not an allegory. These are real events. Matthew is just portraying them in a way that is tangible to his first audience, so that they understand the significance. That ultimate significance being that Jesus shows us a way to be Israel in a way that Israel never quite pulled off. To follow the Son of God is to claim our status as children of God. And that means something for how we live day to day. All right, I'm going to stop right there. We will pick up where we left off next week. Glad that you are here with us tonight. Again, as always, if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to ask about, anything that you want to bring up that stuck out to you, always feel free to drop it in the chat. You can call me, text me, email me, and I will be happy to answer those questions or bat around ideas of stuff that may have struck you for the first time. But we will do this again next week. Glad that you're with us. And on a side note, obviously, please pray for those in Uvalde, Texas. But just as I watch some of my friends and parents have conversations, I know there are people who have lost children who moments like this hit them especially hard. Keep them in your prayers. Mm-hmm. And then for those of us who with kids, even though we understand that events like what happened in Uvalde are, on the grand scheme of things, a rare occurrence. One is entirely too many, and we're way past one at this point. There's still a fear that I think many of us felt as we sent our kids to school today. And I think, I don't know, there's a quote that I read from one of my favorite theologians that I paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me. A prayer for something in which you are not ready to pose a solution or participate in a solution is blasphemy. That's pretty much what the quote said. I think it's just showy. So, yeah, a lot of thoughts. Nothing scripted. Encouraging you to pray. Glad you're with us tonight. We'll do this again next week.